It's another edition of the Free Talk Live's Edgington Post Show. I am Mark Edge. Today is, well, it's a little different than it's been before. I've got two longtime callers of Free Talk Live here to discuss some issues that are important to them. I thought that these guys were good enough, articulate enough, intelligent enough to be able to have this conversation. I'm going to moderate, so I'm going to turn it right over right now to Greg from New York and Libertarian Banker. Guys, what are we going to discuss today?
Well, Mark, thanks for having us on the show, and I'm certainly Greg can speak up here if he needs to. But I think I wanted to talk about the topic of universal basic income. It's one that him and I have talked about before on the show, and we thought it was fitting to do that.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely excited to talk about this. I run a company that's been building community software since 2011 to help communities sort of have their own Facebook, have their own social networks, and not rely on these giant behemoth social networks. And we started to really investigate how money is used, and I think we could do a lot of good. Also, we're going to launch something called Intercoin between communities, which I'm going to talk about. So, yeah, I think this is something I'm really passionate about, and I wanted to get the word out there also.
Absolutely.
So, give me the spiel on universal basic income, Greg.
Sure. Well, there's many things to say, but one of them is, look, we as humanity always seem to, want to have a safety net for people. We don't want them to die because, let's say, they don't have enough resources. And there are many different economic systems that we can set up. Obviously, they're going to have a measure of capitalism, but because of this welfare desire, we're also going to have a measure of socialism or wealth redistribution. So if you're going to have that, the current state of the art is this sort of social democrat progressive agenda where you tax some of the economic activity, and then some of those taxes get used as welfare. But the problem is today, as I feel, and Milton Friedman and many libertarian-leaning economists feel as well, is that if you do means-tested welfare, if you make sure that people are poor first before you give them the money, that creates a powerful disincentive. And you probably know people in your own life who, in order to keep collecting welfare or some benefits, decline jobs which they could very well do and be happy to do, because it would actually remove the steady check that they're getting every month. So basic income has many benefits. I guess one of the main ones that would appeal to libertarian-minded people is that it removes the disincentive for people to just stay on the dole, as they say in England.
Okay. That's your last point there. I will just come back on that real quick. So incentives is what drives the economy. Price and profit is a big incentive for people, and earning money is a huge incentive. Obviously, there are other factors like family and relationships and emotional incentives that are out there. But I would say that incentives are probably the backbone of capitalism. And when you take away the incentives of people to get up and have the desire or even have the necessity to go to work and earn money, that will have a detrimental effect on the free market going forward. So incentives work and handouts really don't. It's been proven time and time again that if you give people money and they don't have to work or earn it, they're either going to waste it or they're going to do things that you don't want them to do with it. So I would sort of argue against you saying that it gives them an incentive to actually go out there and create things. I would say it offers a disincentive for them to do it because there is no profit motive.
I think we agree on the first part, which is that compared to the welfare state that we have today, which additionally tests for people to be poor first, not to be under the poverty line first, before they will give them the money. I'm saying relative to that, that's a disincentive to work. You agree with that, right? Basically,
of course. Any handout that is not earned or voluntary, I would say yeah, absolutely.
But especially if not only are they giving you the money, but they're telling you they will only give you the money if you essentially don't make enough in the first place, right? So then you have an incentive to not make enough in the first place. With basic income, I'm saying relative to the welfare we have today, not to anarcho-capitalist utopia, but what we have today, it would be an improvement in that people who are now, maybe declining job offers, perfectly good job offers, which will give them dignity and fulfillment in their life. They're declining them for a very rational reason. These people are making a rational choice to stay and collect welfare checks. Now, this has changed since the 90s with the Clinton, changing welfare, and now you have to work. But still, means-tested welfare versus basic income. My point is simple. Basic income does not have the disincentive to work that means-tested, to the extent that means-tested welfare does.
So let me jump in real quick. I want to define universal basic income before we go any further. Universal basic income, as I understand it, is an amount of money that's given to everybody in a given country, no matter what their reason is, why they might or might not need it. It's just given to them. However, I think there's an important distinction to make here is, does in your world, Greg, universal basic income, does it replace welfare, or and which welfare, mind you, because this is an overarching terminology we use here in the U.S. Which welfare does it replace, and does it replace?
I would love to see universal basic income phase in and gradually replace means-tested welfare. Obviously, it's not going to happen overnight. And by the way, single-payer systems like single-payer healthcare are basically the same as UBI, universal basic income. They're universal. Everyone gets some insurance. It's just that they're earmarked for a certain thing. So you can't, let's say, use your single-payer healthcare to pay for food. But really, we already have this. Many countries have universal, let's say, health insurance for everybody. That's a form of UBI. So, yeah, I would like to see this crowd out some of the means-tested welfare. One more thing. In Alaska, they have another thing that's called, I think, the something fund, like the state fund.
Oil. It's like an oil reserve fund.
Yes, exactly, where they distribute the proceeds, with the logic that, look, the natural resources of Alaska belong to all the residents. So if they're going to sell those reserves, instead of the government deciding how you're going to spend your money, they just give it to you in the fund and as a dividend. And here's the other thing. People get to choose how to spend their money in UBI. So if they think, okay, they don't need that much health insurance, but they're throwing a party and they need more food, they go out and buy the food. It's also more consumer choice than single-payer systems. But all these things are related, whether you give people money and then you tax it away from the richer people, or whether you or whether you test if they're poor first. I think that latter part just has these disincentives, and I'd rather have consumers have the choice.
And Greg, I will agree with you on the incentive part, that the current system we have, it disincentivizes work to a very large degree. And what you're talking about with universal basic income is maybe a step up from that. I guess I will give you that, but it is not sort of the ideal where we want to be. So here's the point. Next point that I'll make is, you mentioned somebody, somebody ultimately has to decide who gets what and how much money to collect, how much the increases need to be, how much each person in each area get. And so the question is, who decides that? Because it's right now, I could tell you who's going to decide it. If we implement universal basic income, it's going to be the politicians in Washington. And they've been using welfare and tax incentives and all kind of different ways to manipulate voters' minds or to get their way, right? They're just going to use this to their advantage, to their power, because they have the decision on who gets what and how much to collect. So that's a huge problem that is not going to be solved just by getting rid of existing welfare and implementing UBI. You're going to have somebody that takes the reins of power and ultimately abuses it. So how do you solve that?
I think that's a very real concern. And I just want to say right here on the show, I'm not just talking about this, but my company is actually building it. And I want to say right here on the show that your question, one of these days when I called into FTL, it pays to call in because when we had that debate, your question was, prices vary from place to place also. So you don't want to have a central planner decide, okay, this is how much that a doctor in Beverly Hills is going to be paid from this insurance, and this is how much a doctor, in somewhere in rural Kansas is going to be paid. So you're right.
Hold on, Greg. I want to hear the rest of that. And if the audience wants to hear the rest of it too, they're going to have to go to freetalklive.com. This will be on the front page for the first day, and then go to archives.freetalklive.com to get the rest. All right, I wasn't paying attention during the time in the interview, so I basically had to make an insertion for the interruption. We're back, and I'm going to start Greg off right where he left.
Central planning is a big danger here, and also concentration of power, which is why basically I have this vision that I architected over the last year and a half, and now my company is going and going to do an ICO on it, and it's called Intercoin. This is just the name of a token, but really what it does is this. My company is called Cubics, and it's making these Q-Bucks for each community. So we're, like I said, we're making social networks for communities to do things like marketplace or dating or whatever, and people can add their own apps, right? But how do you pay for apps right now? How do you pay for things is with like PayPal, right? With Venmo, with all these things, right? And these things, how do they work? You put your money into PayPal, and then PayPal has an internal currency that
centrally planned.
In a way, yeah, because PayPal is one for all communities. But what if, right? What if each community could have its own PayPal, its own little, bank with gateways to trade other currencies? And when you come into the community, they have their own currency, okay? So the value of that is tremendous for the community. So here's what I see. There's a lot of ideological back and forth, like why did Greece, why did Cyprus go bankrupt? Why did Detroit go bankrupt, and so forth? Why were the accounts frozen? And a lot of these discussions, they talk about how people were irresponsible, how they lived above their means. Maybe when Greece joined the Eurozone, they started importing and buying things on a credit card. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to butt in real quick on your last point. You mentioned these communities that might have their own currency or crypto, or so who decides in that community who gets how much basic income and how much to collect in taxes under your system? Who decides it?
So I'm a big fan of direct democracy, where everybody gets a voice. I feel that money is a great signal for some things, obviously, but it can't be the only signal. Because, for example, if everything's cheap, let's say in Cyprus or St. Petersburg in the USSR, if everything's cheap, you could just buy up a lake, right? And they just dump their stuff in there, or buy up real estate, how people do. So I feel that what should happen is technology should come about where each community could have its own currency. Each member of the community, as defined by the community.
Yeah,
right?
let's define communities before we go any further. What is a community by your definition? Because I experience direct democracy on an annual basis here in New Hampshire. I go to my town meeting, and I can't tell you how many innumerable times there's been a vote on spending, and there's a cacophony of yays and my single nay to spending. That shows that I guess a community could be a group of people that agree on something, in which case all those people have agreed to pay, or a community could be a group of people imposing their will on another group of people in a given geographic area. Go ahead, Greg.
Sure. I think that a community essentially is something that humans do. They form an organization, and somewhere you draw the line, you say, look, this is our immediate nuclear family, or this is our corporation, right? And you have bylaws, and you have some rules as to who becomes a member, who immigrates, or who gets kicked out, and you have to pay dues or whatever. So each community, it's up to them to define who is or is not a member. And then the rules on how are they going to vote for things. Are they going to, monetary policy should be just one of those things that the community gets to decide, like in your thing. How they get to decide is up to the community, but I think, again, there should be software to do things like direct democracy or polling, which I'm the biggest fan of polling. I think that if you do randomized polling, there's no susceptibility to voter turnout or anything else like that. You simply find the pulse of what people want, and that is what people want.
So Greg, so because my mom pushed me out of her womb on a piece of dirt, then I'm only guaranteed a certain amount of this local cryptocurrency that you're talking about. I guess I still don't understand who decides how much each person gets and how much, is collected from each person to then pay that universal basic income out. You still haven't answered that.
Well, right. I mean, obviously, if you were born and just abandoned and nobody took care of you, then nobody would survive that way. So you're adopted by a family, a village, a community, whatever, and they are the ones that they give you what you want, what you need. So, if you survive. So who
decides how much of your currency that I'm going to get?
The community decides.
Okay. Who is how do they decide that?
So one way to decide that would simply be to have a consumer price index, local CPI, which is calculated to see how much money was spent on food yesterday, for example, right? And other goods. But food, and let's stick with food. So you would agree that everyone needs to eat in order to survive regularly.
Well, yeah, I mean, this, you could go down a line of questions and have me say yes to every single one and then give me one at the end and you want me to say yes to it. I know how that goes.
Well,
go on.
Just that one. Everyone needs to eat regularly,
yes.
Right? And drink water. Okay. So we need a system in order to ensure that everybody eats regularly, because the alternative is people will die from lack of food.
Right. It's called price.
Yes, but that system is by itself obviously is not enough, because some people won't have the money.
What geographic area?
What geographic area?
Is it not enough? Because it seems to be working here in the United States. The only time it gets thrown off here in the U.S. is when you've got drug-addled parents that just can't get life together enough to feed their kids. As far as I'm concerned, yes, in fact, I do want the drug-addled parents to face starvation, because then they might come to the conclusion that being drug-addled all the time and starving your kids to death is a bad thing. Giving them free food and free money is going to incentivize the behavior that upsets me.
Well, it might upset you.
It upsets everybody. Nobody likes crack addict parents, Greg.
Okay, I just want to point out, by the way, as a side point, that this is not libertarian to force people to be what you want them to be. But
no, it's not. I'm not attempting to force them to be what they can starve to death. That's a choice.
You don't think that's... Listen to yourself, though. You're saying
yes.
You can either starve to death or do what I want.
No.
I'm not here to tell
you.
Said. Okay, you can be a drug addict all you want, and in this society, people will hand you enough food that you will continue to, keep up your lifestyle of blowjobs behind dumpsters and shooting up heroin in crack houses or whatever it is you want. Once you decide that you can't handle life well enough that you bring a child into this world and then begin systematic starvation of that child because you chose not to give it up for adoption or a whole variety of things. In my perfect libertarian world, there will be little corner stores in the worst sections of town that hand out tubal ligations and vasectomies, and they will give them away with a stipend. Here, I'll pay you $5,000 to get a tubal ligation, and then fine, do what you want.
By the way, who's going to pay for that?
I'm in.
Voluntary. Yeah, I'll donate. I got $500 for it.
Why not just let the people starve later, like you said? Let them have the baby and the baby starves.
Well, because the problem is the baby didn't participate in an activity that it chose.
Yeah, but you don't care. The baby
yes, I do.
Earn its living.
I care. I built an orphanage in Africa. I care.
Wait, why does the baby get a special exception for you? Why doesn't the baby earn its living? It's a freeloader.
The baby didn't try heroin to see if it was a good idea.
So it's the drugs that make... okay, so...
It's the choices.
I went into this thing, but I really want to get out of the weeds here and kind of look at the bigger picture. It was just fun for me to sort of say, listen, people should be free to do what they want. And I think I'm the bigger libertarian in this, but with the basic...
Wow.
No, we're both saying that people should be able to shoot up heroin behind dumpsters and dispense low-cost blowjobs if that's what they want to do. I, however, believe that is, I have a moral objection to giving people money to subsidize that lifestyle.
Okay. And that's another way, I don't want to dwell on this point, but that's another way of saying that you want to take away people's safety net for their life, and you want to economically coerce them into doing what you want, which is to get off of drugs.
When you say take away is an important, we're talking about a timeline. At some point or another, that safety net was given to them too. So when I only wish to retract it to its previous location, which was a time when people were responsible for their actions. It's not like opium dens are new. People did opium before there was welfare.
Right. And okay, so let me get back to the bigger picture here, okay?
Who decides how much money I get, and how is the community deciding that? I still don't know.
Right, but I think Mark's point is very good also, which is what about people who are irresponsible and they can't earn money? My biggest objection to that is you're lumping everybody together into one group, which you say is every member of that group is capable, if they wanted, to just earn a living wage. Everybody. Whether they are crippled, disabled, a child, whether they're mentally handicapped, if they're old, doesn't matter. You're putting them all into one thing, which is called drug addicts. And I'm saying there are many reasons why they would not be able to, including the simple reason they may not find a job in time before they starve. It could happen, right?
Certainly there are people that could starve to death. And, I would say that the charities would likely spring up that would hopefully help people that desperately need it. But, what they're going to start, the first thing they're going to do is count fingers and toes. And if you've got all 20 of them, that's probably check box 1, right? And then they're going to do some kind of, evaluation to see if your limbs move. And, there's check box 2. Then they're going to start figuring out exactly how mentally ill you are, because I believe it's a continuum. And here I am functioning with some level of mental illness today. So, I think that's where we're at. I think there's a real problem. I will qualify it with saying that something like Asperger's could be a real problem because, people. It's easier to call somebody an asshole than to call them mentally ill. Go ahead.
No, so is your criteria for getting food guaranteed to you, or
nothing's guaranteed?
What if you have 9 fingers and toes? That means you're out of luck, right?
9 figures is you seem to be able to do pretty good. I mean, there's a lot of guys
Here's
working
the
with.
difference, though, Greg. The way that you're proposing is somebody decides for you. In the way we're proposing, the market decides. You mentioned the community decides. What we're talking about is the community deciding how much each person gets. We're talking about price signals, and the market is a community. So if you think about it that way, it's anyway.
Well, I don't want to take away any price signals. See, with basic income, people choose where to spend their money. And like I said, if there's, it's sort of like we have now with the universal health care in some countries, except they only choose which doctor to go to. Here, they can choose between a doctor, a food producer, a rent, meaning whatever's going on in their lives, they get to have a little bit of money, everybody does, in order to make the correct economic decision for themselves. That is what they do, and money is just a system. It's just a system of being able to have people give each other what they need anyway.
Exactly, but it's one of the best signals out there on it's the best forms of communication out there is price.
Right, but it's not the best. It's not a perfect system. If Mark just said some people are going to starve.
Well, what you're talking about is giving those people the $1,000, and so where is their incentive to work? Because I'll tell you, hunger is a great incentive to work. Many animals do that every day. Well, that's why they go out there and hunt.
I agree, but incentive to work is not enough to do it, and you could see that by the thousands of dead animals that died from starvation.
Sometimes that happens. So that's an important factor. There's different types of animals out there, especially mammals. We're talking about R types and K types here. R types, their whole species design or system is starvation, right? Like, so they fill up a given environment eat everything to the point that everything's gone, and then at some point or another, some starve off to find the amount of people that can survive, or amount of beings that can survive in a given system. The K types generally hunt the R types, so it's the amount of people will. The amount of beings will then expand to the amount of prey in a given environment. So, yes, starvation is a signal that Mother Nature gives on how many beings can be in a given environment. And I would suggest if somebody who fits the realm of mental health to some extent or another can't navigate our system as it is today, then they need a different system. The way we get to them to a different system is either they move geographically or they die off.
Well, that's the thing. Yep. You talk about free market, you're really espousing the law of nature, the natural state and law of the jungle. You're basically accepting money. You're saying, look, the weaker among us, whether they are the disabled person or the person that simply, you're not going to pay this person a living wage because they won't do anything for you that you can benefit from enough that you won't be losing money. So they will have to depend either on charity or they can go ahead and starve. And by the way, humans have been moving away from the state of nature for thousands of years to the point where now we have a population explosion and we're raising our own livestock in order to eat them. Billions.
Greg, I would argue that the explosion in population is because of government and the state, because it requires and forces people together, and requires them to pay for each other, the ones that are going to starve, and then thus creates an abundance. And there you go with the population bubble. It's kind of like with the Federal Reserve. When they hold interest rates artificially low, it creates bubbles in the economy. When government controls population through welfare and through, doling out free food, you get bubbles in population.
I agree with you here. I mean, I could blame government. I can blame technology. We have medicine now, according to this logic, where we can save 9.999 out of 10 children, whereas before, people, even kings, would have many of their children die in childbirth. So you're saying that because we now are able to save those who would otherwise have just died through natural selection, therefore we have a population split. I agree with you that in the grand scheme of things, that may be a problem, but as humans, we applaud those things that we're able to save lives. We're not here to say, well, that's actually a mistake. Why don't we just pull the plug on all these kids that would have died?
I'm not saying we pull plug on kids. I'm saying that we don't centrally plan income, and we don't centrally plan taxation. We voluntarily plan that. We allow people to interact and create their income for themselves and have two people decide, hey, you're worth this amount of money. And even if you're crippled, there is still some value there. And so, just to think that every kid in a sort of libertarian utopia is going to starve and every crippled man is going to be, that's a ridiculous proposition. It really is. I have family members who have been disabled for decades who our family takes care of. And not because we decide that the government told us to do it, it's because that's what you do with your family. So,
you run your family as a socialist welfare distribution.
Absolutely. But it's completely voluntary.
Exactly. So you just said you have a group of people that have decided to act in a socially redistributive way. In other words, the kids don't obviously earn, the money for the food, and probably your relatives don't who need the help, and you give it to them. Why do you do that?
Because of that's how humans are, right? We interact with each other. But I'm telling you, it's voluntary, Greg. I don't understand how UBI, your argument for universal basic income, is voluntary. I don't understand that. Okay. I'm talking about voluntary interactions. You're talking about involuntary.
So I'm extending what you just said about your family, right? And you don't get to choose your family, but you might be able to choose your community.
You do. You do get to choose your family. So if I have mean Uncle Ralph and he just constantly running off at the mouth and insulting people, and he doesn't like foreigners, he doesn't like ethnic people, he doesn't like Uncle Ralph is pretty much everything that everyone dislikes in the world.
Sounds like another Ralph I've not.
Right. At some point or another, I can just say, Uncle Ralph, I've had it with you and your crap, and you're not living off here, living off me and insulting my family and people that I hold dear any longer. So get out. And so, I mean, I don't have to choose to support Uncle Ralph simply because we're blood related.
Your family. I just meant that, you don't choose your mom or your dad. They're still your mom and dad, even if you tell them to get out.
Exactly. But you don't have to give them money. You're not required to. It's voluntary.
Right. This is about incentives. We started this on incentives, Greg, and it's about incentives. People in my family are incentivized to behave, including myself, right? Like my family's going to fall apart if I don't behave in a particular fashion. So this is about implementing the community standards on a group. And in my family's case, that's true. And then, society as a whole, that's true. We have what we call universally preferred behavior out there.
There you go.
And that behavior doesn't include the BJ's behind the dumpster thing, unless you're getting one, I suppose.
Right. And I totally agree with you. I think you guys have brought up a very good framework in which to discuss it. Okay? If you are a misanthrope or I don't want to use the word sociopath, but it's just a technical term. If you are a person who prefers to be completely self-interested and not help your family, okay, that's your right. And then you have your elderly parents and you tell them, look, you've taken care of me, but now screw you. Go and, you're 80 years old. Go do whatever you want. I'm not paying for any of your shit. You could do that. But what I'm saying is then the next level is you have empathy for your family, which will lead you to essentially institute basic income. You're giving the kids an allowance. You're feeding your parents. And what I am arguing for is extending that same compassion or a brotherhood to a community level where you decide. The community could be anything. It could be 5 families. It could be, and you can kick people out of the community too. It's exactly the same.
So back to the universal basic income again. How so you're going to tax me if I live in your community to pay for your universal basic income? You're saying the community decides how much is taken and then how much is given out. So if I live in your quote community, are you gonna steal it from me?
Stealing. Well, you got to define stealing. What do you mean?
Taking something by force.
Stealing that's robbery. I don't think that's the same.
Okay, well let's use robbery then. That's fine. Whatever term you want to use.
Okay, fine.
Are you going to force me to pay for your universal basic income in your community?
Are the kids forcing the parents to feed them?
No.
So why are they feeding them?
Well, I feed my daughter because she nags the crap out of me. But it's because you brought that. You feel an obligation. Maybe you feel an obligation to do it.
Maybe she's robbing you, man. Have you tried not feeding her? See what happens. You should go and get a job.
I had a job at 12.
What you're saying is that I am the children of my community?
If you are among the weaker people economically, then yes.
I'm not. I'm the one. I'm an earner. I'm a payer into the system. Let's say I'm one that's paying in more, or you're stealing more from me than I'm taking out. So what I'm saying is that your point I'm trying to prove, we can go back and forth with the questions, is that universal basic income is involuntary. The argument it sounds like you're trying to make is that it somehow is voluntary because the community is deciding what happens with the money. I guess I don't get it.
If I just change the name community to family or tribe, okay? Let's just stick with family. You're the breadwinner in your family or one of the breadwinners and the earners. Why do you feed your kids, man? Just try the other. Why don't you try it for like 2 weeks?
I'll tell you why, Greg. Do you want to know why? Because the number one reason is I love her, right? And I want to see her live. The second reason is if I don't, they'll come and take her from me.
So you're doing
the government will take her from me.
You're actually how much is the second reason? Meaning, if Child Protective Services didn't exist and you lived in a libertarian utopia, do you think many of the parents would just say, "Listen, I don't have"?
No, they'd probably all feed their children. 99% of them would feed their children because that's what humans do.
So why did you bring
up? Humans don't go to their neighbor and steal their money.
But why did you bring up the second incentive then of the Child Protective? It does nothing then, according to you. Child Protective Services.
Well, no, it does. I mean, obviously, I'm very conscious of how, I can't let her run around outside naked in the neighborhood. And I mean, there are certain things that I can't allow her to do because I'll get arrested for that.
No, but listen, what I'm trying to say is Child Protective Services, if their only function was to make sure that the parents who are not feeding their kids get their kids taken away so the kids can eat. If that was the only function of that agency, do you really think there would be no delinquent? There are no delinquent parents. All the parents are completely willing to.
No, they're obviously laws don't mean anything. Obviously, they're just words on pieces of paper, Greg. I understand that.
I guess what I'm asking is, you're saying if 99.9% of parents would feed their kids without Child Protective Services, right? Without. Mm-hmm. So then you're saying that most people, that it's completely useless to have that agency to ensure the well-being of kids.
For the food aspect, yes, probably, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Fine. And I'm willing to even concede that to you. And then answer me, why did you bring up that point? If you're going to feed your kids just on the first reason alone that you love them, why bring up the second point that someone's going to hunt you down if you don't?
I guess because I was trying to make a point to you about involuntary interactions.
But that's like
that's all. That was why I brought that up, because I'm trying to make a point about I'm talking about voluntary interactions of feeding my child is voluntary, helping out disabled relatives is voluntary, giving money to any community organizations that's all voluntary. Taxation is not. And UBI is funded through taxation, therefore UBI is not voluntary.
So if you got mad at your daughter, and how old is your daughter, if I may ask?
Well, why? But I don't understand how family is voluntary, Greg. I just explained that. Family is voluntary.
That means
taxation and UBI is not voluntary.
Wait, so it's voluntary. Let's agree that it's voluntary.
Yeah. Family is voluntary, yes.
That means you can stop feeding your daughter.
Yeah, probably, yeah. If I wanted to, absolutely.
So you could stop feeding her for as long as you wanted because it's voluntary. Even if she was begging you for food, you could just say nope.
Yep, I suspect she'd ask the wife.
Voluntarily go next door or ask my wife, or you know what I mean? I'm not forcing her. She's not in a cage and I'm starving her. I mean, you know what I mean? Like in your example, if I don't give her food, she's got other sources.
Well, my point is,
it's voluntary, Greg. UBI is not. Explain to me how UBI is voluntary.
By your definition of voluntary, I can go into voluntarism, and I think this might be a good next topic to do. Because obviously there's coercion on many fronts, not just the coercion of men with guns coming to take 1% of your dollars income. There are many other coercions, like people getting thrown out of their house because they can't pay. Right? Property, which I keep going back to, property rights necessitate violence and coercion also. It's just another institution.
But they're voluntary. That's voluntary.
That's not voluntary.
It is. If you signed an agreement, Greg, then you voluntarily signed the agreement, man.
I didn't
sign an agreement.
I didn't sign no stinking social contract or agreements for my rent.
But if you sign a mortgage or you sign a lease agreement, that's voluntary. And you just talked about kicking people out of houses.
I didn't. I was born in my house and I stay here, and I never signed anything. I can squat here because I was born here. I never signed anything.
But some agreement then, maybe there's verbal or nonverbal with somebody has allowed you to stay where you are.
Never had the need because
then maybe you live in some stinking commune that I don't know about. I don't know where you live. What the hell?
I'm trying to give you. My point is, according to your logic, if I never signed one single piece of paper for the rent, I have no obligation to pay the rent. Correct?
Okay.
So in other words, if I am born in my apartment and I simply never leave and I never have to ask to come back, then I can squat in there forever and do whatever I want.
No, because there is somebody who has signed and been allowed to stay.
Yeah, but that's not
you're probably living with, if you're talking about like maybe a kid and parent situation where a kid's living with their parent. Obviously, in the lease, I don't know if you've ever written a lease, but it says in there, your kids in there, any kids that you have are in this lease. Most of them will spell that out, Greg. So
I'm sorry, Mr. Libertarian banker, but I'm going to go all Lysander Spooner on you. Lysander Spooner said, the Constitution is no authority because you can't bind your kids and your grandkids to whatever you agree, even if you did agree, he said. And not everybody did. But if everyone even agreed in that generation, why should I pay the rent just because you agreed that I would do it?
Yeah, you don't have to. I didn't agree that you'd pay it. It says in the contract that you can live here if I pay the rent. So you're my kid. You're my kid. In the contract, it says that you're allowed to live here, and any of your family, immediate family or whatever, can live in this dwelling. Okay. If I have a kid while I'm living in that dwelling, I don't have to go to the landlord and write them into the lease. It's already in there, and I'm the one that's obligated to pay. Okay. So if I don't pay, and you are on the lease with me as living with me, right? Then you get kicked out too. I don't understand why that's hard to say. I mean, we're going back to the point about it being property rights being forced. Absolutely. But it's voluntary force, right?
It's not voluntary for me because I was born. I never signed anything. And now I'm forced to vacate the premises. But I never agreed to anything. I just lived here.
Okay. So I don't understand what are you driving at here?
I'm driving at that's the situation that you are complaining about with a city or a state or any community. You were born in it, okay? You were born in it. You never signed any social contract. But if you had, you wouldn't be complaining because you had signed it. The thing is, if I was born in an apartment and I never signed anything, no system would really say, well, I guess he could do whatever he wants forever. No. That's not how things work. And the only reason you use that example is because of scale. City's bigger than an apartment.
Okay.
So you can literally be born in a city, not sign anything, and that's fine. But in fact, you did sign. Whenever you got your driver's license, you voluntarily agreed for selective service, for example.
I didn't.
That's one example. Unless you're in a state where they don't have it. So you've signed all kinds of contracts by this point. Contracts are not what gives you rights or not rights. But I'm just trying to say the private property system itself is coercive also. And you can't say
absolutely, but it's voluntary coercion.
I just showed you that it's not, because even if you don't sign, you still...
Greg, it's just... I'm trying to think of a way to combat your logic, Greg, and I hate you because of it.
Okay,
Mark, help me out.
I'm happy to tell you. Go ahead. So the fact is that being born into an apartment does not give you rights to that apartment. If I own that apartment or a duplex or whatever it is that you're born into, you're gosh darn right. You turn 18 and both of your parents die on that day, and then suddenly you get deed to the apartment? What crazy land am I living in here?
No, I agree with you. That's the concept of property rights. You own the apartment. You get to push people around who never signed anything with you because you have this concept that you own it.
Right. And because of that concept, I gave that person a place to live for 18 years. Yep. That concept allows us to distribute wealth in a way that, prior to that basically was done at the tip of a sword. People came in, they wiped everybody out, they took everybody else's slavery. Socialism isn't a step forward, it's a step back.
No, I agree with what you said, but listen to yourself. I'm just going to say what you're saying back to you, okay? You've described a system called private property, which has rules. A person can own a certain land or a certain building or whatever, however big. And according to this system, you get to evict people by force who never signed anything with you. But you say the system is just better, has better outcomes than the sword and everything else. So you're arguing on the basis of consequentialism. And that's the same thing I can say for government. I can say, look, before government, or let's say basic income, forget government. I can say before redistribution of wealth, people used to die when they were poor. People used to go hungry and die, and now they don't. So I'm not arguing for my system on the basis of the NAP, but I'm saying property rights are also violating the NAP, because you just say, oh, you've never signed anything, but I've been letting you live here. And I say, no, you haven't. I disagree. You say, well, I have a bigger gun organization than you, and I will decide to evict you.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. And I think that's a fine wrap-up. Appreciate you both for participating.
Hey, that was great. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Greg, you're a great mind. I appreciate you.
Plug your website, Greg.
I hope it didn't get too heated in the end.
Love it.
Plug your website, Greg.
Right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Go to intercoin.org and you can listen. You could read about the new token that we are producing and hoping to do an ICO on. That will hopefully inspire communities to run their own fiscal policy, which after this debate, I think at least we all agree is better than the current federal means-tested welfare system that we have today.
Thank you.
Right on. Love it. Thanks, guys.